So I hope it's working.
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So hi, everybody. And I'm Claudia, and I'm really happy that to join you today and that you took the time to be here. I'm Claudia Orellana Rodriguez, and I work at the University of Amsterdam, and I'm a data scientist also at the Analytics for a Better World Institute. So this is, I'm part of the team who organizes the fellowship, and I'm happy to be here with you today. And as you know, today we will talk about text, all about text, text analytics, text mining. But before jumping into it, I'd like also to encourage you to ask questions, or if you have a comment about what we will talk about, please feel free to share it. Before we jump into the text analytics and work with you through this session, is tell you what it's possible to do with a text, but I'd like you to see it through a project that we did, so that you see that how we did it in an actual real project with a nonprofit. So before moving into it, I'd like to talk to you about one important part of working with text, which is understanding that text is not, or I think data in per se, not only text, but data is not necessarily representing all the groups in the same way, and that it's important to have to keep this in mind when working with data in any scenario that you are working on. What I will tell you, this is a really short intro. It will be probably about 10 minutes of this, and then we will jump into the text mining. So what I will tell you about is now based mainly on these two books that you see now, so Invisible Women in Data Feminism. And no worries, it's not only about feminism that I will talk here, but it is important. The examples these books show are very important for us to understanding the communities we want to represent and the communities we care about, and why it is important to know if they are fairly represented in the data we have. So as you might know, and if you don't yet, it is important that we keep in mind that data is often collected, is interpreted, disseminated, and prioritized by people who hold privilege. So how people who, for example, have access to health services and then are willing to share their data with us, those people are not necessarily all people from minorities. And then we'll end up learning more about a specific group than about the other. And it happens in positive scenarios, like in healthcare, but it also happens in scenarios like crime detection, for example, that then there is a group that ends up being misrepresented and thought of as having a higher rate of crime than another one, but it's just because there is more data that has been collected about that group. And and so also people who have access to data, sometimes we have a problem, we have a project that we have to work on, but we don't have access to data. Then the data we end up using is also data that we need to make sure that it was collected in a fair way and that it represents all the groups that we care about in the same way as much as possible. So when we talk about data here, as I mentioned, we could be used to numbers from many different cases, but it can also be colors, it can also be text, as we will see today. It can be stories, it can be music or sounds. So any information, any type of information that can be systematically collected, organized, and analyzed. And it is important that we start thinking about the data and its quality and its properties, since it is mere data without much meaning yet. because that data that we start using will become a story, and that story is that the one we will disseminate, the one we will make decisions upon, and the one that we will, for example, report for those of you who prepare reports. So if it started being already wrong and we didn't care about it at the beginning, or we didn't know at the beginning, then the story that we end up producing will also, will not have the quality that we expect. And so I'd like to leave you with these 3 principles. So when we have a data problem or a project, this could be, I will give you an example later on with text, but this could, the principles that we should always keep in mind is to how do we examine the data and challenge it. So how do we know that this data is actually good for the analysis that we will make? And if it's not, what do we need to do for it to make it better? Then rethink. So if, for example, we are just given some data, or we come up to a data set, so how is it actually, how this was collected, and what, or for example, if you're already using a model, was this model trained on data that is, first we need to know what data was this trained on, and if it was, we have doubts. There is a lot of research going now into the ethics on how models have been trained, on what type of data, and what can we make it more balanced, how can we make it more balanced? And then consider context, which is the 3rd principle. So we know for sure that data is not neutral, it's not objective. And then, of course, they perpetuate the social relations that we have. So we just move them to the data, and that we need to break. So, for example, why do we have to examine and challenge? So the structures that we see in data and how data is collected, or we can already see it in the people who already are working in tech, for example. So out of 100 people, we have only 26 women. If you that's one example, that we have only 26 women. And out of all these 100 people, including the 26 women, we only have 3 women, which will be non-white, for example. So we need to understand that there is a view of the world, that there is a way in which data was collected that is not necessarily representing people of color, for example, or people from communities that are not overwhelmingly white and male, for example. That's one, just one thing. Also, we have the case of some neighborhoods in New York where they have a huge amount of cameras that are checking the streets for crimes. And when the neighborhoods are of a high rate of Black people, there is more cameras in those neighborhoods. And then what happens is that we have ended up with the idea that more crime happens in these neighborhoods, but it's not necessarily the case. It's just there is more cameras in these neighborhoods. So it's almost like we have set it up to be this way. So just rethinking the way we collect data and the data we end up with, it will make us, I think, end up with better products in the end. Also, from Invisible Women, from one of the books that I showed you, we have that also the way in which transportation systems are designed can also be more advantageous for certain groups of people than for others. And for groups, for example, that do not make a direct commute from point A to point B, but rather go from point A to some other points and then end up in point B, then the way that we pay for public transport at the moment is not necessarily advantageous for these other groups that do not commute from home to work and otherwise. So that's one thing to keep in mind, or how different things on how we live our lives and data is created, it can be disadvantageous for some communities. And for example, one of the last things I want to say about this is if you see here, I show you the same 2 plots. It's the same with the same data, but one says that mental health in jail, and then you can see that it's more for white people. So this is like you will say, okay, so people who are white people who end up in jail, it's because they have a mental illness, but it's not necessarily the case. The case is that for other groups like Black, Hispanic, or others, is less likely that they will be thought to have a mental illness, and that's that way why they ended up in jail. They don't even get to the point where they are considered to be ill, and that's what made them end up in jail. So it's just the same data, but the way we describe our results can also impact the reader of the work we produce. So with this premise, so I want to tell you that AI, of course, is transformative, but it's still limited. That is not there yet to the point where it can sense and deal with bias. We are responsible to do so. So not everyone is represented equally in the data. Also, it cannot yet explain, and I don't know if it will come to that point, but it cannot explain decisions and actions to human users. So not everyone yet understands how AI works, or the questions the outcomes or the predictions from it. So it's our responsibility to do so. And also, of course, it cannot feel empathy, right? So we as humans have to be involved in the decisions that it makes, and then we have to be always explaining and not necessarily always trusting all that is resulting from the analysis that we see. And with that, I want to tell you that the example I will show you today, how did we deal with some of these issues that I just mentioned to you. The example that I will walk you through is about extracting insights and understanding the framing of disasters in digital media. And I will give this with a concrete example in Malawi. And that is a joint work from us at ABW and the University of Amsterdam and 510, which is the data initiative for the Netherlands Red Cross. So if there is any questions so far, please let me know. I will switch to the other slides now. Okay, so now we have moved to the understanding the framing of disasters in digital media, and this is a text mining project that we had with Hannah. Hannah was a master's student at the Vrije University here in the Netherlands, here in Amsterdam. And what the project was a joint project with 510, as I mentioned, and 510, what was happening is that they have systems in place so that they can react early when a disaster is happening in X country where they are. But there are specific countries where they have less information about, and they aren't sure yet how to get a better understanding of is it possible to understand what the situation is? Is it possible to use local media, for example, to understand or to get enough information to predict future events of these kind of disasters? So the idea was on two sides. One was to understand what is possible from the text to inform systems that are already in place in 510. And then the second, and the work that Hannah was doing was is it possible to understand from media, from what is posted on the newspapers in Malawi, is it possible to understand what is the view that with which these disasters are reported? For example, are they framed in a certain way? Or are they objective? So these were the two main aims for this study. So Malawi is a country which is really prone to floods, and they have two types of floods, mainly as it happens elsewhere, but they are frequently suffering of flash floods and river floods. So the flash floods are the floods that happen, for example, because there is a lot of trash in the streets, and then when it rains a bit, all the drainage gets blocked and the roads are flooded, and then there is no way that or the communication between one side and another of the country or a city gets interrupted, and then people do not get access to maybe basic services that they should have access to all the time. And then we have river floods, and that's intuitive, because then it comes after a lot of rain, and then rivers flood, and then we end up with a flooded city or district. So 510 has a text miner already in place, and that text miner they apply in different contexts and for different countries, not only for Malawi. But the idea in this case was that they already had a news impact miner, that what they do is to go and check for national and local newspapers and see what is it possible to learn from events that happened in the past to predict events that will happen in the future, and if it's possible at all. Then with this, they extract from the newspapers, they extract what they call impact data, so severity and possible affected population and areas. And then this information that they extract helps 510 make decisions on what's useful to extract from these newspapers. So basically, it's the same thing that we will keep in place, but we want to feed it differently. So for example, it's easy to say that, okay, let's take national and local newspapers in an area, but there are areas that you don't know what newspapers to use, what newspapers are valuable to include. And if there are, at some point, some of them who really report something in a useful light. So they already, 510 already had in place a set of words that they used to extract news from the newspapers, but this set of words wasn't working well for them. So so we had these questions on how are flood events framed in the Malawian news media, and what entities were mostly emphasized. Entities we understand as people, organization, who was mentioned in the media when these floods happened, and what was the tone of the media with respect to this event. It was in a positive way, if any, it was in a negative way. Was somebody being blamed? And what are the major frames present in the news coverage of flood events? So frames being, is it a look from an economical perspective or from a political perspective? How is it reported in Malawi? And this I will skip some, because the slides I'm showing you are from Hannah's master's thesis presentation. So I will skip some of the technicalities of it. But for example, what I will tell you is that we ended up, of course, we wanted to detect what are the words that are related to these two types of floods, and what are the newspapers that are important to take into account in Malawi for informing the system that 510 has in place, and how many news articles should we take into account, how many do we have that we can use in a period of time that I will tell you which period was. And what we will do is also another challenge that I will walk you through was, how do we collect this data and where do we start? So first, what keywords are important for flood detection? Who is relevant? So what entities? And in which sentiment do we talk about the floods? And then from the content analysis part from the framing, it was, is it economical? Who is held responsible for this? Is it a human interest, or how do we, or is it a conflict of powers that is reflected in the media? And I'll show you. So this is, for example, one real news article. This is from one of the newspapers called Nyasa Times, and as you see, we have the date. Then we have the text, and what I'm showing you here is a very clean view of the article, but surrounding what I'm showing you here, it's a huge amount of ads, unrelated information that we did not need and did not want to include in our analysis. Yeah, and then we also have the headlines that are quite tabloid-like. They were a lot about grabbing the attention of the reader and not necessarily as informative as we were expecting them to be. What we are looking for is, do they report technical information? In this case, technical information is how many buildings were affected, how many people were affected, and so on. And yeah, so in the end, this is one of the best things that we can show you from the analysis. In the end, with the analysis that we did, we could say, okay, when flash floods and river floods happened in Malawi, these are the districts that are most affected by what was reported in the media. So it's important that I tell you that. So this was reported in the media, and this is what we, in the end, extracted from all the news articles that we analyzed. And I will tell you why I think this differs a bit from the reality of Malawi. I will explain that later. Yeah, most of the articles that we found were neutral, which was a good thing because we are expecting that news media is not loaded with emotion, right? But rather reports what's actually happening. So when flash floods occur, they are most likely to be reported in a negative tone. And then we see also that they tend to blame more their local authorities, because then it has to do with a lot of things like the management of the trash, or for example, how clean the roads are, what's the culture of the people who live there, why would people trash their roads, right? So that was one of maybe the subjects that keep coming up. And then, so there is one newspapers from the ones that we analyzed that was mostly reporting in a negative tone most of the time. So yeah, other newspapers were more neutral, but this one was mostly always reported in a negative tone. So yeah. Yeah, this is more details on how stories are framed. And yeah, so this is mostly the framing of the problem that I will show you now. And now we will jump to some code. Any questions so far? Okay. So I don't expect you to, in this session, to follow all the code, which is a simple code, but I'm not expecting you to follow or to execute anything now or to run anything now. I haven't shared with you the file. But how I wanted to structure this is to show you how we used first notebooks, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with them and already use them. But for those who don't, I think it's a good way of working when you are working as a team as well, because we can collaborate on these notebooks. So this is all in Google Colab. And of course, if you are familiar with it, you know how useful it can be for allocating resources that you don't necessarily have. So if you are to run a model that needs a lot of resources and you don't have a GPU, then you can have access to a GPU there, and that ends up being really useful. So this is a bit of how we started. So as I said, this is the introduction, so we don't want to spend time there. But there were some issues that we faced before we could even start the analysis. So what happened here is that first, we didn't know what trusted sources were there in Malawi to analyze. And we didn't have any updated links or clean data to use from the media websites. So for a start, we have to identify what newspapers to include in our study. And of course, there are many newspapers or news media in Malawi, but how will you approach this issue when you are to collect data and you don't know necessarily who to trust. And I don't know if it happens to you sometimes, or I will say to most of us, when we start a project, we don't necessarily have the data available, but have to collect it or have to find out where there is an available data set that will be suitable for our needs. So at the beginning, we started looking for all the possible newspapers in Malawi, and there is a disadvantage that I will also talk about. So the languages of Malawi, and there are several languages, the main one is not English. So there is an issue also that you have to consider with the models that you use, because there is a disadvantage for low resource languages, like in this case of some of the local languages in Malawi. So we had to go with this, because it was the first run as well for us, was to go with material in English for starters. So we were also limited by this. So what were the newspapers to go to? And in this case, we ended up with these 5 after a lot of back and forth with people on the ground. So 510 also has people deployed there in Malawi, and they ask around people, locals, what newspapers do you read? Which newspapers do you trust? And after this, and also there was a researcher on the ground that was also a Dutch researcher who helped us a lot on identifying this, going around asking people. And after a lot of back and forth, we ended up with these 5 newspapers. And one other challenge that we faced on this was that when we looked at all these newspapers and went to the websites, then there were, in some of them, there were no news articles from before 2020. And one of the main years that we wanted to look at was 2019, because that's when Malawi was really affected by floods. So what happened with the data before 2020? That's another issue that we faced, and how to access it. So in the end, one of these newspapers, I think it was Zodiac, we couldn't include in the analysis because there was no way. They had no indexed data from before 2020, so we couldn't study the articles that they published. And that was one of the hurdles that we had to overcome. And the second problem that we had was that if, for example, we went looking into their websites, there was so much material that was about advertisement that it was too noisy for us to really get to clean data at the beginning. So even if we already had the newspapers that were to be included, we didn't have a direct way to see, okay, these are the actual articles that we will use from these newspapers. And I will also tell you some of the challenges that we found in there. So
Claudia?
Yeah.
There's some questions in the chat. Is it a good time for those?
Yeah.
So the first question is, what was the standard, or how did you determine or judge the tone of the newspaper as positive or negative?
Yeah, this was done with, in our case, it was done in a very simple way. It can be done, of course, in many other more complex way, but this was done by sentiment analysis and looking at positive, just the polarity, so positive or negative. And for this, it was mostly informing the framing that I mentioned that Hannah had to report in her thesis. So it was mostly to inform her discussion on how do you see the polarity of these articles. And by polarity, I mean that it was dictionary based and that we took the text and saw how many, basically the words that were negative or positive in the articles. So it was a simple thing to do. I will show it later.
Okay. Valerie would like to know, will we also be looking at how to get the data, like the connection with the APIs and how to approach the data owners to request that?
Yeah, I'll show you how we did it as well.
Okay. Anas would like to know how to access this notebook.
Yeah, I can share this notebook with you. I didn't want to, I think at the beginning, because it's a lot of information and I didn't want you to feel you had to go through the code with me now. But this notebook I can share with you right after the talk.
Maybe we can post it to the GitHub repo.
Yeah.
That's a good place to store it. Hannah would like to know, how does multilingual text mining project apply sentiment analysis across languages?
Yeah, I think, so you say multilingual. Yeah, I think it depends a lot on the languages right now. Also one thing to keep in mind is what I will show you now. It's some very basics on how we dealt with this specific problem. There are now many more advanced ways on dealing with multilinguality, and also it depends. There are languages that are high resource. Those we call, for example, when there are models already trained, there are data sets that serve for these models to be trained, and then our results you can see it's a higher quality than when we are actually dealing with these kind of local languages that haven't been used for training the models yet. So if you, for example, we have another project with 510 that deals with French, for example, and with English and with Arabic. For French and English, the classification of text, it's a very good performance, but for Arabic, not yet. So it depends on the language that you use, and there are models already that support, if you use transformers, for example, there are transformers there that you can use for dealing with multilinguality, and you don't have to, to basically limit yourself to one specific language. Yeah.
All right, let's pause the questions for now and I'll let you continue.
Yeah. So, So about the data collection, and I will tell you how we did it. In this case, we thought, okay, if we cannot access directly the newspapers, we could, but it was not the best in terms of the quality of the data that we were finding there. So we needed another approach. And the approach I will tell you now is specific for Twitter. That is what we used before. Now it's not the same because, as you know, if you are using Twitter or have used it before for research, you will know that now it's quite limited. And for example, the API that we used to use to collect this data is now blocked. So we can't collect this data anymore in the academic side of things as we were doing before. So bear with me, this is for Twitter, but the text techniques that I will show, they apply for other data, not only for tweets. But what we did was to approach it this way. So we use Twark. Twark is a library that is used to access tweets, to search on the Twitter archive. So we thought, okay, we knew that we needed all the tweets in that case, because we found all the newspapers we found in Twitter. And what was really nice about finding them there is that, unlike the article that we saw on the webpage that was noisy, what happened was that because of the limited space that they had in Twitter, they daily post the headline and the URL of the news article. So when we dealt with this, it was a much cleaner approach than going to the webpage directly. So we search on Twitter all the tweets that were from 2019, from the 1st of January until May, for each of the newspapers. So you see here the tweet ID from, and you see here the tweet ID, the Twitter ID, in this case for Malawi 24. And we stored all those tweets into a JSON format. That's how Twark gives you the results. And Twark still works, by the way. If you still have access to the Twitter API, then you can still use it. So Yeah, and if, for example, you have a user that you don't know the Twitter handler, yeah, there are many services for converting those into the Twitter ID that we had to use in this case. So from this, we collected all the tweets for all the different news media that we were going to include in this analysis. And I want to show you how what we end up with. So we have the text, of course, of the tweet. So this was the text, gospel, and then we have the URL, right? And we cared about having tweets that included a URL because that's what we are going to use next for the actual text of the article. So yeah, and from one tweet that you see that it's quite short, we end up with a lot of metadata here, like, for example, if it's sensitive. And the good thing about Twark is that it gives you already extra annotations on the tweet. So if it's possibly sensitive, yeah, of course, some of the things that already Twitter gives you, like the language, the metrics of it, and annotations, which is this is the case. For example, if there is somebody who is being mentioned, and this automatically can label it for you, like to say it's a person being mentioned or it's an organization being mentioned. Yeah, what was the source of the tweet? Yeah, and many other things. So we already have a lot of useful information here, but we cared about the text of the tweet and, of course, the URL. So we specifically about the expanded URL that we are going to use later on for the data extraction. So this is just one step. From that, we got all the possible tweets from these newspapers, and then we extracted all the URLs. So as you see here, we don't have anymore all the text of the tweet, but rather a list of URLs that we are going to use for all the period of time that is of interest for us. And what we did was take all these URLs. If you see here, we have yet a lot of other information like youthful female entrepreneurs or a gospel diva, tit for tada, or yeah. So not everything that has to do yet, or only that has to do with floods, but everything that we could possibly download from that period of time. And what we did was first to download the web page and into a text file for processing later on. Why? Can we take a second to discuss why it made sense for us to do it this way, to first download everything and work locally? Does somebody would like to share?
Sorry, it's faster to process.
Yeah, that's one thing. It's you're right. It's faster to process. And then one more thing that that happens is that sometimes, and it has happened to me before as well, I feel, okay, I already have the URL, so I can work on it online.
Sometimes it can get deleted.
Exactly.
Or changed.
It can change.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes. But also remember, I think one more thing that we have to keep in mind is that in that case, when we are accessing the URLs, we become the bot, right? So we can also be banned or kind of blocked, or say, okay, you have to wait for a while before coming back to our website and getting the data. So if you can, and if you are not working with huge amounts of text, right? This wasn't too much. So it was faster, it was safer for us. We knew the content was there. So let's work on it locally and don't risk it. And then, yeah, we will process it later. So then we knew for sure that we had the data that we had to use. Thanks everybody.
I think there is something else. I mean, if the process, if the file has a specific structure that your code work with and potentially changes, then you have to take care of the changes, right? So you have a version of the file that works actually.
Yeah, exactly.
Version control.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, for us, it worked better this way. If, for example, you need to make sure that you have the latest version of a file. In our case, we knew this was content from 2019. It was unlikely to change anymore, but we did want to have it. Also, we didn't know for sure. What if this news media decide that, okay, it's about time to get rid of this data as they do? So we didn't want to risk it in that way. So yeah, that was one of our main reason for doing it this way. So now we have all the data. We came from the first cleaning, understanding what newspapers to use. After that, we thought, okay, let's do it through Twitter. They are active there. We know they are published. They post their URLs every day. Every day, the latest URLs, the latest the latest news with the URL, so we could access it. Then we can jump to the other aspect of it, which was, I think there was a question about this as well, like that how did we deal with the noise of the surrounding the news article. And in our case, I think some of you might be already familiar with Beautiful Soup, which is a simple but very useful parser that you can, for example, get your HTML and basically say, okay, I want these specific elements of it for me to use. So we, from each newspaper, we went and checked each URL, then extracted all the necessary information that we had, which was, of course, the text, the date, the author, and then there are other ways. I don't know if you have at some point heard about Boilerplate, which is a library as well that you can use to clean up all that is considered to be in the margin of a web page, and then you can keep the center, which is thought to have the main content there. But in our case, we knew what we wanted from the pages, so we just went with it. And I think one issue that we faced here, that I don't know if you have faced it as well, is that what happens is that although there's been a lot of emphasis on being standard on the way we publish HTML, we are not there yet. And what happened is that we ended up having to use different elements for each newspaper because they named them differently. So, for example, title was almost always title, but for the text, some call it text, some called it, I think, article. So we realized that when we were running this parser, some of the news articles for specific newspapers were empty because the element was not the right name or wasn't the same name. So we had to basically build one for each newspaper, but in this case, it wasn't a big deal because it was probably one element, and it was, we only had 4 newspapers, so it wasn't a big deal. But of course, if you are working with more sources, you need another way around. Yeah, so now we have all the URLs. This was basically this step that was, let's clean the HTML. And if you see, yeah, I need, so the main content where we need, and is, yeah, if you see, for Niasa, for example, it's called Niasa content. So that is very particular for this newspaper. Yeah, for others is counter inner or entry content anti-clear fix. So it's different for each one. So yeah, that was our way, but you can do in the way that is more convenient for you. And yeah, the next step was to, one of the main issues that 510 had in this case was that they didn't know what were useful terms that they could feed their text miner so that they can get useful data for understanding disasters, in this case, floods. So what we did was to take all the possible, because we knew that in this period of time, most of the news that were covered were about the floods. So we kind of trusted that, okay, we have a good data set here, but we had to look further into it and see if it's actually the case. So in here we used a part of speech tagger. Maybe some of you are already also familiar with Spacey. And if you are not, it's really useful for many annotation tasks, like part of speech, which I'll show you how it will look like, or entity recognition as well. You can use it. It's very nice for it. And it's really easy to use for independently of the domain you work on. But I will also talk about specific weaknesses that we discover with it by using it. So yeah, you can train, of course, this component depending on the data that you will need if it's a specific domain. In our case, it was more straightforward because it was news articles. So it works already well for news articles. So what we did was we took all the texts now that we had them, and then we extracted the keywords for them. And as you see here, we were not necessarily interested in verbs because in our case, in our specific problem, we weren't going for, it wasn't so useful for us to get verbs like drown or swim, or those weren't the ones that we were looking for, but mostly the adjectives or proper nouns. Those were really the ones that we were looking for. And these were, of course, informed by 510 as well. And I'll show you. So basically, we took the text for all the articles that we have. And what part of speech does is that you have this is a real sentence that we had in the text. So Malawi is likely to experience more floods. And then you see from the structure of the sentence, what the part of a speech tagger will do is that it will tell you the function of the word within the sentence. So it's a pronoun, if it's an adjective, if it's a verb, a noun. If you see floods, for example, it's a noun, and it was useful for us in our case. So first we extracted all those. And then, here just for visualization, what did we end up with? We ended up with, for example, all these like flood, people, word, vision, affected, district, and some proper nouns that were definitely important to us, like Falombe, or specific names of the districts of Malawi that allowed us to understand better if there were specific places that were more affected than others, or what will become useful words to search for news related to floods later on. So that was the next step. And something interesting from here that I wanted to mention is that one of the most important words that you will imagine or nouns that we ended up with was water, of course, because we are dealing with floods. But the funny, I don't know if funny, but the interesting thing in the end was that water was really noisy for us. We didn't end up using water as one of the main keywords for the text miner for 510. Why do you think we did not use water in the end? Anyone?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand the word. Water?
Yeah, water, yes.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Carlos says that water is too common. Water is used everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. So because of your context, right, you end up with, are you familiar with stop words?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have the English language, right? And then we have these stop words like the, and,
in, out.
So they are stop words, and they are called this way because when you are actually analyzing one of these problems or projects with text and a huge amount of text, they are not informative anymore, right? Because they are so common in the language, you will find them in all the documents, and they are not particular to the problem or the context that you are working on. And it ends up that depending on the context you work with, there will be other words that are not like the and a, but will become a stop word for you. And also that is allowed that you modify the stop words that you are using. There are lists of stop words that you can use, but you can also, you can also include these other words that become stop words for you, if I'm being clear. So for us, water, in the end, you know what happened with water was that there was a lot of water shortage, for example, in the country. It had nothing to do with floods. And also, I didn't know, but it turns out that Malawi has a huge issue with water pumps being stolen. And then when we included water, a lot of the articles that we ended up with were about the water pumps, so not about floods. So like words like that was not really critical or important for us. I saw. Yeah, I see some of the questions from Martin that there is, if these are all in GDL, not all of them. Some are really too local or too, I don't know how to describe exactly if this is the correct word, but a little bit informal, if you will. They are not really well structured, and some, it seems that they are more tabloid-like than actually newspapers. And there is this issue about the local language is not English, right? So this is a very important thing to keep in mind, because the information that we will find in English is not necessarily faithful to what is happening locally. So this is one issue that we found. Local people will not necessarily go to these newspapers to read about the floods, but they are almost the only resource that we have outside to learn about these kind of cases. So we do know that from the get-go, we have a bias in this data. As I mentioned before, this was something we also saw that there are discrepancies between the actual situation that was happening in Malawi and the one that was reported in the newspapers for international readers. In some cases, the same situation was posted with more negativity locally, or not negativity, but actually reality. But for readers outside, it was more like, okay, it's not so bad. We are not doing so bad. So that, I think, is already an issue that we did not necessarily overcome with this, but we don't have any other way yet. The one way that I think will be great to do this same analysis with will be with data from the radio, because people are much more, radio is much more popular there than newspapers, but we couldn't find any transcripts from the radio shows there. So apparently many of them, and I'm not saying they don't exist, we did not get access to them. Many people read the news on the radio, and they don't keep the archive of this. So this was also an issue. So there is another approach that we are trying to, it's to get access to radio transcript that will be more faithful, I will say, to the actual situation. Yeah.
Or what about satellite data, satellite imagery? Or that's not real time enough to see which areas are within what?
No, definitely there is that approach is, for example, there is another project that 510 has that is using satellite images to understand, for example, after an earthquake, like in the case of Turkey recently, they used imagery, satellite images to understand if there were buildings that were more prone to being destroyed than others. But in this case, the idea was to see if, for example, for a low resource, because you already have text in abundance, right? And it's easier to get access to than to images. It will be, is it possible for me to learn from how floods are reported in the past, and to see if I can understand better if they will happen in the future, or where will they happen in the future? So it was just a different type of need in this case, but they are also working with satellite images in this case. Yeah, we could do the transcript, but that has to be, yeah, there is one question about if we can extract text from the radio, from the audio. Of course, there is this speech to text, but in that case, we need somebody to be there kind of, yeah, probably recording, or because we can, I don't know if we have the resources yet, 510, yet to do it in real time. But that, of course, is one of the best approaches to do it, because they don't, as I say, the text that they for sure have at some point is not archived. So we don't have any records afterwards. And I'm not saying that no radio in Malawi does it, but we haven't gotten access to this. So yeah. And yeah, and Valerie asked if there is a mechanism to detect these noisy words. In our case, as I say, yeah, by default, you go with stop words, but it depends also on the context. So in some cases, and especially now that we work with transformers, for example, if you remove all the stop words from the sentences, from the models, for example, that already use sentence transformers, and that means that you take a sentence, and you make a vector out of the sentence, and then using vectors, now you compare if sentences are similar, if, for example, one sentence is in meaning like the same of the other, to the other. In this case, if we remove stop words, then we remove the meaning of the sentence as well. So it doesn't, you don't need to remove stop words anymore from all the sentences, depending on what you use. But in this case, we had to like kind of manually check, is this actually a word that we have, that we can use? Is this a word that is informative? So it depends on your context. But for this problem, it was a smaller situation, a smaller scenario. So it was possible for us, and not only possible, but actually wished for, that we spend time looking at the words that we ended up with. Yeah.
So thank you, Claudia. Just to double check if I understood this correctly. So the problem you described about water,
yes,
that's something you then manually happen to find out because it just happened to be often. But if you wanted to automate this, you're suggesting there's a way of comparing sentences and see if the content of the sentences also aligns. And
yeah,
if not,
yeah, exactly. In this case, because we used, in this case, it was important to have specific keywords to generate results, because the keywords are one of the aspects that 510 wanted us to detect. So we had to basically check, use the keywords that we ended up with. As I said before, we looked at the different parts of the speech, and we ended up with a huge list of keywords. We saw which keywords are frequent, which are not. And then after a discussion with experts, people from 510 who had already crafted a list of keywords, we were checking, okay, what keyword have you not included yet? What keyword is there, but it's not generating the results we expect. And then when we added water, that was, of course, you will say it's intuitive because it's floods, and yeah. Some mentioned there that probably water will not be mentioned, but in this case it is. But what happens is that when we added that, we saw that the quality of the articles that we retrieved using it was not improving, but rather it was being, it was going down. So in that case, it was a manual analysis, but it was because of how important it was that these words were cleaned and crafted for the tool that we are looking for. It won't necessarily be done the same in all the scenarios. Yeah.
Maybe you can use generative AI to automate the keywords generation, please.
Yeah, it could be, I think, but I think in these cases, for example, when you really want to, when the quality of your keywords, it will actually affect, I will say, the kind of resources that you will direct for a country, or the early detection of a disaster, something that is so humanly important and so critical in terms of resources. I think we are not there yet, to do it completely automatically. You know, we can get a lot of help, but there still needs to be this final round to understand, okay, do we still use all of the ones that were automatically generated, or do we need to actually leave some out? I think it will definitely still need some human in the end. Yeah. And yeah, and I want to also show you really quickly, because some of you mentioned about sentiment analysis. So sentiment analysis is it's when we take the text and we basically say, is this text, there are different ways. One is called the most, I will say, basic, is called polarity detection. So this is either a text is positive or negative or neutral. And we also have other ways. For example, we can say if a text is, depending if it's dictionary based, for example, which is how it was mostly done before, you can have it in different dimensions. For example, some of the work we have done before is not necessarily only polarity, but it's also about if a text is more loaded with fear, happiness, surprise, for example. In this case, those dimensions weren't needed, but it's mostly we wanted to understand if a newspaper was loading their stories with more positive polarity or not. And of course, what we expected to find is if they were more neutral, because what you will expect is that the information that they deliver to you is not yet loaded with an opinion, but rather you can form your own. But this was mostly in terms of the framing that I tell you that Hannah, the student, had to report in her thesis, and not necessarily as an input for 510 systems. So again, with this, we did a simple approach with Spacie. So Spacie that I mentioned before. And of course, with this, you have in the end the polarity of it. This is a direct result from Spacie. You get polarity, you get if it's subjective, if it's and the assessment. So if it's positive, negative, neutral. So we did that basically, and this is a very short thing because I want it's not anything that we did beyond using Spacie for this. And finally, what I wanted to show you is the name entity recognition, that we also wanted to know who is mentioned in the news, if it's a specific person or organization that is continuously mentioned there, and in which light. So for name entity recognition, you can, of course, label your text with the different people, organization, currency. It can be also, I will show you later on that there are different types, and you can decide which ones you would like to include in your analysis, which labels are you looking for. In our case, it wasn't necessarily the currency or time, but it was people and organizations. So yeah, you take, and this also with Spacie, and they have a tool that it allows you to visualize the labeling. It's called Displacie. And of course, I wanted to mention, so in case you are interested, Spacie, they have a license for academics. So, or for example, if you are from an organization where you do research as well, so researchers within nonprofits, you can ask for a license, and you can, this I didn't need a license for. They also give access to all their tools, but if you are going to use it in maybe a larger project, or if you need more resources from them, you can get a free license from them. So it's quite nice. And so basically what you have is your text. This is the text of one of the articles that we have. And it gives us, okay, if you see the morning hours, okay, that's one entity that it discovers in the text and is labeled as time. Then the parliament, it labels it as organization. Frank, it's a person. Blessings is a person. Yeah. And yeah, I don't know if you can imagine what is one of the issues that we find with this labeling. And that again has to do with a language being, or a context being well known or used before for training or not. So
maybe the numeric number as date, like labeled as date, that could not be date.
Yeah, exactly. So in this case, for example, it's I think it's the age. But the thing is, another problem that we find, and I think this also gives you an idea that although we have a huge head start with these labelers, so we can extract from here, because when you are interested in persons, organizations, it's a lot. We are there. I think we are quite close to being there. It's most of the time is rightly labeled. So, but what happened in this case, and not necessarily in the article that I'm showing you, is that if you see, for example, so Richard Hara is a person, but we found, for example, that for very local names, for example, I think in this case, I will dare to say that Frank Mwenefungubo was named as a person because Frank was there, and many of the names that these models have been trained on already include like Western names. But in many cases, what happened is that for local names, they were mislabeled as a place, for example, and we knew it was a person. So in that case, still required a lot from us to clean the entities and say, no, this is not a person, it's a name. And you can see this happening in contexts that are very local. So be careful always when working with this kind of data, that although you get the labels, I think, as I mentioned before, you get the labels, which give you a lot of help because you cannot manually do all this, but you always need to double check that your results are correct, or if you are not sure, we need to go and look, because I wasn't sure in some cases if it was a place, because I'm not also familiar with the context. So I needed to go and check, okay, no, this is not a place, it's a person, right? So that was one of the other challenges that we found. And in the end, what I showed you before with the map was thanks to all these annotations that we have. For example, in many cases when we had like Karonga, for example, here, Karonga is a district. So Karonga was mentioned a lot when they talk about flash floods, for example. So after normalizing, we realized, okay, Karonga, when a flash flood happens, Karonga is always there. So in the future, we know that if a flash flood is to happen, Karonga needs to be high on the list on where to send help in terms of maybe food or resources or people to help on clearing the situation. So this basically ended up with them mapping the districts that were more prone to be affected by flash floods or river floods. So this was, as I say, one example that I wanted to walk you through, so that you see this is an actual project that we carried on, and that, there is a lot of possibilities in this, but we still also found flaws, and especially when dealing with, for example, I come from a country where we speak Spanish, and it's very local as well. Many of the authorities, even though there is a lot of coverage for us in English elsewhere, I don't think there is faithful to what is happening in our country. So I think we need to be careful of these kind of issues, independently of the context that you work on. Yeah, so I think with this, I can stop sharing if you have more questions. Yeah, so I can see more questions here. Yeah, so for the Ayman asks if for this project that is too far away, if do data scientists or one who works with this type of projects has to travel and assess what exists there in person. I think for this project, it was definitely a huge help for us that there was this researcher there who helped us, not only, and it wasn't necessarily only her opinion, but it was her talking to locals and saying, what are the newspapers that you trust? What are newspapers that you read daily? And I think one of the main results was actually locals there do not necessarily trust in newspapers more than they do in radio. Radio is much more cultural for them. They go for the radio like on a daily basis. And if you see, for example, as a Spanish speaker, for example, in my country, I wouldn't necessarily go for an English newspaper in my country, but I will read in my language. So I think that is the same case that happens there. Knowing her, for example, this researcher there helped us at least get some understanding of what were the possible sources to use. But as I say, I don't think this is the best material that we could have, that we could look at when trying to learn about these disasters. Yeah, and what needs to be considered when choosing the sentiment analysis tool? I think one will be to see how much do you want to know and what are you going to use the results for. In this case, what the student needed was, and it wasn't for 510 side, but rather it was the student side or the student thesis. She needed to understand if there was any load of sentiment in the article, and this could be positive or negative, and that was enough for her. But in one of the papers that we have worked on, for example, we wanted to recommend content depending on how it makes people feel. And then in that case, it was about movies. So movies can make you feel a lot of things, right? So not only I feel good or bad, but they can make you feel sad or happy, and we wanted to use that feeling to say, why not? Today I want to watch a movie that makes me feel happy. So we wanted to take movies that were classified in this way to recommend them to you. So in this case, polarity, so positivity and negativity was not enough for us. And one mentions that often it does not recognize African names. And I think you are definitely right. There is a service, and there is now a lot of emphasis put into that people from other, from non-English speaking countries don't have. I think so far it's been almost expected that you go, and if you want to learn about the international context or even internet as a whole, it has to most of the time be in English, and then you have to get the view of the world in English. But in many cases, it shouldn't happen this way, right? So one of my colleagues is working on, it's called Listen AI. And basically what they are doing is translating the web, the internet, to African languages, so that people who speak any local language in Africa, from Ethiopia or other African countries, don't need to see the internet or to understand what's happening in the world in English only, but in their local language. So I think there are efforts and they are worth it, and we should support them, but we are still not there yet. Yeah, I will say Martin or Martina. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing correctly. But if you are interested, this Listen AI, I'll write it here. Listen. They are translating a lot of the names, a lot of the articles that we see on the internet. They have people in in many countries in Africa translating the internet, so that we have more data sets in local languages to train these models so that we don't have to rely or translate to English all the time, because as we saw here, it's not working necessarily in the way we need.
Claudia?
Yeah.
Francesco asks, or says the API for Twitter costs about 100 per month and the number of queries you can make is very limited. Is there any alternative to Twitter? What about Reddit or Facebook?
Yeah, of course. What I showed here is Twitter because, as I say, we used it before and we had access for through the academic API. But sadly, it's not the case anymore. I don't know. I will hope that at some point they open it again. But Twitter is not the only alternative. What we need to make sure of is that we understand also the differences of the audience or the user base for each of the social media platforms, because Twitter is very particular as well. There, if you are doing research, you can find a lot of researchers there. For example, in Reddit, you find a whole another world, right? Like you have a lot of other discussions, longer texts as well. So I think it will give you even more to analyze in depending on what you are looking for. You can find hugely interesting discussions to see. Also, I have seen a lot of network analysis done in Reddit. So what subreddits do we have? Who participates there? You can have that a lot. Then we have, of course, Facebook and Instagram and TikTok that has already opened as well their API for US academics, but I think they will open it for international researchers. So if you are working on a research project, and of course you don't have to be necessarily like a researcher, but I think because you are in a nonprofit, when you work with one of these projects, you can claim that you are participating in research and hopefully they give you access to the APIs. But for example, in Instagram, we have a user base that is quite young. And then you have more things that are more visual rather than more rich in text. So it depends on what your topic is. You can use a different platform. Twitter is not the only one by far. Yeah, it's Listen AI, Valerie. I wrote it there. I should probably write they asked, Valerie asked what's the project called that tries to translate the internet into African languages. So. And yeah, I mean, they are doing sorry. There. So they are doing a huge effort on translating, but they are, of course, they are always needing local people to help. So if you are in an African country and you want to help Listen, do so. It will be beneficial for all of us.
All right.
It's interesting. Lisan means tongue in Arabic.
Tongue.
Tongue, and tongue could mean a language too. Like you speak with the Arabic tongue or with the English tongue. It's another name for a language.
Interesting. Then it must be also in my friend, my colleague is Ethiopian, so it must mean something, right? In Ethiopian, in one of the
it could be Swahili.
Could be Swahili. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know if you have any other question or otherwise. Yeah, I'm grateful that you joined, and I hope you found it useful. Yeah. Please let me know the ones who would like to have the notebook, and I can share with you.
I think if you can post the link to the notebook in the GitHub repo that we have for this source, that'd be perfect. Are there any other questions from anyone?
Yes, there's one question I've just asked about it, about the Arabic language model. So if there is available techniques or models that work with the Arabic models, because there is like a lot of, and most I think of the countries that are within that conflict countries are in the Middle East, and that if there is like available models that you can feed us, that will be good.
Yeah, I will say the best way now, at least how I will approach now working with any of these problems, will be starting with going for the transformers and going with Hugging Face. I don't know if you're familiar, but if you are not, it's really worth that you take a look. They have a lot of models for translation, for classification, and the one I sent you is specific for Arabic. I couldn't say, because I'm not familiar with it. I know that in the problem that I mentioned with that 510 is using, is doing text classification for Arabic, French, and English. French and English did way better. They had better results than Arabic, but I don't think it's far behind. There is a lot of focus on this, so I will either use the ones that you see here that I sent you and keep an eye for upcoming ones, because Hugging Face allows people to develop their own models and upload them there, and then you have a lot of users to give you feedback and say, okay, this is useful or not. So if it's already here, it's already promising. So I will give it a try.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right, I don't think there's any other questions. So thank you so much, Claudia. And I'll see everyone in 40 minutes for the next session.
Thanks,
All right.
everybody.